That's also on a live feed shirt now. It's a YouTube. Well, there's a recorder and stuff. It's YouTube is there isn't obvious there isn't on even on top of that's just keep that on there. Specifically designed.
Can you zoom in later or through your laptop?
No, through this. That's why do it all. You can have more stuff in there. But
So just for talk's sake, my dad is a trade focus, so you need to see some speaker. Is it all CC quality?
we don't do 60 because
So see when people watch, are they just seeing the picture? Or are they seeing all that stuff inside? How did I do it? Oh, and that's just it there. Is it just it there? That's not as old as you said? You have to look on YouTube. I know it's been left in the shop. I'm saying this. They're all over YouTube.
you have to learn about YouTube because it's the time
Good afternoon, everyone. I think probably most of you know by now that I'm Amanda Stewart, the Chief Executive of the Policing Board, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our offices here today for the second in our seminar series, which is in relation to tackling race hate crime. A lot of you have been here at the last one because I do recognise a lot of the faces, and you'll know that we did choose topics for the seminar series which are clearly linked to the priorities within the policing plan, and also which contribute to the delivery of our strategic outcomes in 2020. Within the plan, the protection of vulnerable people is a clear priority for the police, and particularly those who have been a victim of hate crime, and specifically hate crime, which is why we have picked this topic for today. In terms of the running order for the day, we're going to start proceedings with a short film, and it will set the scene in terms of hate crime generally, and specifically then race hate crime. We will then hear from our Human Rights Advisor, Ali Kilpatrick, who will provide a short overview of the issues emerging from the thematic review that she undertook on behalf of the board. Following that, we're pleased to be joined today by Paul Gianassi, who is the head of the Cross-Government Hate Crime Programme, and Paul will share with us his thoughts on the issue from a national perspective. His input's probably very timely given the events in recent weeks. We will then have time for questions and answers, and I'll be asking the board chair and Superintendent Emma Bond from the PSNI to join the panel at that stage. In terms of just general housekeeping before I pass over, there's no fire drill planned for the day. If it goes off, to follow our staff out of the building. And again, photography will be taken during the seminar. If you do not wish to be included in any of the photographs, if you could just let a member of the staff know or speak to myself before the event today. And also just finally, we are live streaming the event today. You're very welcome to make comments using the hashtag NIPBLive or hashtag Policing Matters and tagging us at NI Policing Board. Thank you, and I will start a short film which will set the scene.
Hate crime, what is it, and how does it affect us? Hate incidents and hate crimes are acts of violence and intimidation targeted at people because of their perceived difference. They involve hostility or prejudice towards people based on race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disability, or because they're transgender. Hate crime can take many forms: assaults, verbal abuse, hate mail, or damage to homes and property. It can have a devastating impact on victims and their families, leaving them feeling isolated, unsafe, and permanently anxious, and can cause a sense of fear and vulnerability to resonate throughout the community. The 2011 census shows we've become an increasingly diverse society, with over 200,000 of us born outside Northern Ireland, and over 32,000 people belonging to minority ethnic groups. Such diversity has enriched our society, economically and culturally. However, since 2011, the PSNI has recorded over 6,000 racist hate incidents. Last year alone, the police dealt with 660 race hate crimes, an average of 2 every day.
To actually be faced and told that you shouldn't be here, that I'll do everything to make you leave, that is serious. When I'm in the street, my car, sometimes the windscreen was smashed, my 4 tires were totally slashed, and the children would be sometimes called names in the street. Anything like that happened in the area, and any time that happened, actually people knew, but they would not react to it. I get the impression they didn't want to get involved. if you're going to stay there in that community, you need the reaction from people in the community.
The Policing Board recognises that racism is not the responsibility of the police alone, but that they do have a very central role to play. That's why the Policing Board, in its latest Human Rights Thematic Review, has examined how police identify, record and investigate race-hate crime. The review also examines how victims are encouraged to report incidents and how they are supported by the police. The report makes 14 recommendations for the PSNI so that they can provide a better response. The focus for the board is to make sure that policing provides the best service to victims and that victims have the confidence to report hate crime to the police. No victim should ever be deterred from reporting because they think it's not worth it. We'll now hear from the Policing Board's Human Rights Advisor, Alison Kilpatrick, followed by Paul Gianassi, head of the Cross Government Hate Crime Programme.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us during your lunchtime and giving your support to what is a very important issue, but I think one that's often misunderstood and sometimes overlooked. When I started this process of review on behalf of the Performance Committee, I found myself routinely having to justify undertaking it. In other thematic reviews, I haven't been asked questions along the same lines. I was asked, for example, why is the Policing Board using its limited resources to examine the policing of race-hate crime when there are so many other pressing issues? Why are we giving preferential treatment to one group of victims over others? Why shouldn't every victim be treated in the same way? Surely equality requires it. And why are the police making hate crime a priority? Doesn't that encourage people to play the race card? Now, I'll try to deal with some of those in turn. But the board was very clear. So let me just make some space. The board was very clear that it was undertaking this review because hate crime is a particularly insidious type of crime because it targets the most marginalised and vulnerable members of our society. It leaves them isolated and terrified in their own homes, in the street and in their workplace. Crimes motivated by hostility or prejudice towards a person's race, being that core human identity, cause extreme hurt and distress, and we saw a touch of that in the film. It's beyond that experienced, what we're told from other crimes, which aren't motivated by that same hostility or prejudice. A victim forever carries that with them. It's not something they can get rid of, it's not something they can change. They feel they will forever be at risk of encountering another racist incident. Hate crimes are also called by the police signal crimes. And I prefer the expression message crimes because what they do is they tell a community of which the victim is a member that it's different somehow and not accepted. It affects not only an individual, in fact it can end an individual's life. It creates a fear that can oppress the entire community. And that means all of us. William Pickens, who's the great African-American writer at the turn of the century, put it this way. It's often quoted, but I'm not sure we ever really think about what it means. To cheapen the lives of any group of men, and I've put in brackets and women, cheapens the lives of all men, even our own. And another way of putting it, one stakeholder said to me, if you divide the community into them, us and them, one day you're going to be them, and what do you do then? So we need to be clear, it affects all of us, and affects all of us equally. Also, I think what the committee recognised is that how we treat newcomers or people who are different tells us a lot about ourselves as a society, but it also tells us a lot about the police service, our police service, how they respond to victims of hate crime. As for equality, treating everyone the same, that's not equality, treating everyone in exactly the same way. Rather, that's perpetuation, in my view, of discrimination and marginalisation. Victims of hate crime aren't given special treatment. They're not preferred over others. They are, it's true, in some respects treated differently, but only to the extent they may require it to ensure they get equal protection. And a police service, a good police service, recognises that. And I think I can say that that's what we have. We have a good police service in Northern Ireland. Excuse me. You'll have to forgive me. I was in Glastonbury for 5 days and I'm losing my voice. No crime committed. Just punished myself. It is worth a trip, anyone who gets a chance. We don't tend to, or at least I've never been asked, why we make different provision for example, children, the elderly, those with disabilities. And in fact, we demand that they get the treatment that they need. And it should be the same for those who've joined us more recently, or those who've been born of a different colour but reside locally. They deserve no less than what we expect for ourselves, but sometimes that little extra bit of help is needed to achieve that equality. To understand racism and hate crime, and therefore to take it seriously and respond to it appropriately, what you need to do, and this was hammered home to me right at the outset, was approach it from the vantage point of the victim. There are people here today, and I've spoken to some of them, not many, thankfully, who don't need me or us to tell them what it's like to be a victim of hate crime. But for the rest of us who've been more fortunate, we do need to understand the impact of hate crime. Those questions that I put at the beginning, those wouldn't be asked, I think, if we truly understood it. And it was explained to me in this way. Try to imagine life with all its common pressures of keeping home and family safe, but with those additional pressures of thinking that everywhere you go, everything you do, you're being watched, judged, suspected. Imagine going into your local shop and having somebody watch your every move in case you steal something. Imagine moving into a new area, knowing you don't know anybody, but you sense when you move in that you're resented, that they think you've jumped the queue, you're going to bring the neighbourhood down. You don't get the opportunity to form relationships, to get to know those people. They only see that you're different. Then imagine being terrified that someone's going to take that resentment out on you or your children. And then add to that fear the fact that if you go to the police, there are going to be reprisals, and that in any event, no one's going to be able to protect you. So that's not everyone's experience, but it was very common. And I heard many different versions of pretty much the same thing. I think you saw it on the film. We see that a hate incident is reported to the police roughly 7 hours of every day. We saw that 2 hate crimes, so not an incident but a crime, twice a day. Those figures are likely to be the tip of the iceberg. As much as we like to deny it, racism and racial discrimination is everywhere. It involves any act where a person is treated unfairly or vilified because of their race, colour, descent, national, ethnic origin. It can range from the exclusion of people socially, to being indifferent to their views and experiences, to prejudice, stereotyping, name-calling, taunting, insults, active, direct exclusion of people from services or opportunities. And in its most serious manifestation, which is when the police tend to see it most starkly, racial discrimination is demonstrated in behaviour that embodies hate, abuse and violence. From speaking with victims of race hate and those who advocate for them, I heard examples of each of those, from the name-calling, the persistent abuse, arson, criminal damage and violence. But the majority told me they didn't report it, not just to the police, but to anyone. They didn't think anything could or would be done. They just wanted to live their lives without stirring up any more trouble for themselves and their families. So rather than playing down the race card, rather playing the race card, what I found was victims who play it down. And by this stage, you might think I'm tactfully avoiding mentioning the actual report and the technical findings, but I've deliberately not started with those. And for the very simple reason that we have to accept that race hate and the crimes that often follow aren't a creation of the police, and they aren't going to be solved by the police alone. It's easier, I think, certainly, for us to point the finger at the police and concentrate on what they do or don't do. But I think that absolves ourselves from our collective part in it. We need to be mindful not to divorce hate crime from the social considerations and discuss it and concentrate on it simply as a law and order problem. Now, we know it is a law and order problem, but it's so much more than that. The most powerful message I took from stakeholders was that no technical fix, although there was quite a lot still to do, would be enough unless and until we, and they were keen to remind me that means police and non-police, address our conscious and unconscious prejudice, and we carry that with us, I think, in all we do. We have to start by altering our mindset and challenging racial stereotyping and denigration wherever it appears. Race hate crime and the reasons for it have to be understood. Otherwise, nothing will change. And it may sound strange coming from a lawyer, but law often isn't the answer, and I suspect it probably isn't the answer in this case. Certainly, law without commitment or understanding is going to prove worthless. So having said all of that by way of opening, and don't worry, I'm not going to be very much longer, I will turn to the thematic review itself. I'll give you a flavour of it simply in the time available, but I would recommend the report to you for more detailed and in-depth analysis. The committee recognised very early, I certainly didn't have to tell them, that prejudice and abuse based on race was an increasing area of concern, and that police officers, while not the cause and not the solution alone, did have a critical role to play where racism manifests or has the potential to manifest in the form of hate incidents and crimes. They asked me to conduct a review on their behalf, and throughout that process we're very much involved and obviously agreed the report in its final version. So we examined many aspects of the police response to prevention, detection, victim support, community engagement, and 14 recommendations were made. Certainly some improvement was identified which could be made, but the review also highlights some good practice that was seen across the police service. This report is intended to support the police as they continue those efforts to tackle racist hate crime and to secure safer communities for the whole of Northern Ireland. They've already considered the report very quickly and gave a considered response to all of the recommendations. So the committee will now monitor implementation of those recommendations and report further. The approach to this review was like all the other work that I certainly do on behalf of the committee, which is to examine it from a human rights perspective. And the beauty of that approach, I think, is that it requires that the rights of an individual are valued regardless of identity, status, or position. The rights truly are universal. They're not weighted towards the powerful at the expense of the weak. And they value the dignity of human life, not status, not income, not identity papers or allegiance or language. They require the state not only to refrain from violating individuals' rights, but also to take positive action to ensure that the rights are not violated by others. And that, I think, is where the human rights approach really does prove valuable. It regulates and imposes obligations between people as well as between the state and the individual. So PSNI performance was measured against those standards, primarily the standards contained within the European Convention on Human Rights, which are obviously those that are enforceable directly in the local courts. But we did look at other international treaties and instruments, not least because they're regularly used to interpret the rights contained within the Convention. And the European Court of Human Rights has been very active in this area and has interpreted rights as imposing a wide range of obligations on member states in relation to hate crime. For example, the criminal justice system must be able to identify and punish racist motivated crime. Investigations must be prompt and effective. All reasonable steps must be taken to unmask any racist motive, and state agencies investigating crime must be impartial in the assessment of the evidence. So I considered all of that in this review. And the results were, I think, on the whole, mixed. But the committee found no lack of effort or commitment on the part of the police to improving the service it provides. The committee agreed there were many areas of good practice, and some I'd like to highlight are the enhanced focus on meaningful community engagement, meeting stakeholders, participating in conferences, developing public campaigns, educational leaflets, videos, etc. All very effective, and I looked at all of them. Bespoke hate crime training was developed and delivered, which is very positive. However, the committee did have some disappointment at the extent of the training and the fact that it wasn't delivered to accompany the rollout of the new service procedure, which was a missed opportunity. In 2015, PSNI put in place a new tailored command structure for hate incidents and crimes, and that was to ensure that it remains a strategic priority, but also consistency across all 11 policing districts, and it certainly looks to be achieving that. The committee certainly believes the new approach has been effective and has begun to drive improvements in victim support, investigative standards, and the collection of analytical information. Pardon me. The restructuring did encounter, however, some teething problems, which we heard about, and contributors to the thematic expressed some dissatisfaction that there wasn't an identified single point of contact and felt that they lost that sort of input and local knowledge. In April 2016, however, PSNI took that on board. They reconsidered the number of hate and signal crime officers and decided a greater number ought to be recruited, which they set about doing very quickly. So towards the end of this thematic review process, stakeholders did say that they had noticed already a distinct improvement, and we're very hopeful about the future direction. And it's certainly hoped that a single point of contact within each policing area will enable those officers to maintain very close contact with marginalised groups and those who represent them. In addition to the new command structure, what the PSNI did was introduce a new risk assessment process, which took some time, was very carefully and deliberately thought through, and that runs concurrently with the investigative process, and it's complete in respect of each and every victim. That's been welcomed very much by stakeholders because it means the central focus is now very much on the victim. This report also considered the extent to which police are able to identify and prevent hate crime, and it encourages the police to build and maintain more comprehensive data and compile a more informative profile of those areas in which hate crime does tend to manifest and the times of the year, because certainly there does seem to be some connection with some what we call trigger events. And when the EU referendum result came in, and you'll all recall, I'm sure, some of the rhetoric that accompanied it, and then we had the dreadful terrorist attacks, PSNI were very quick to put in place a plan to deal with any spike in hate crime, and they should be commended for that. However, a specific frustration was expressed during the review, which was that agencies, including the police, didn't offer a great deal by way of prevention or in response to persistent abuse, so that some of the abuse that we heard on the video, which is happening recurrently. Sometimes we heard victims were simply advised to move out of the area and find somewhere safer to live. Now, all the victims I spoke to said they understood exactly why the police were advising that, and the police officers who said that to them were being kind. They said that was their interpretation of it. But it's not good enough, and if we can't do more, then we need to very seriously consider what's going wrong. Even if it were an appropriate response, what many of them were saying was that they experienced great difficulty finding the alternative accommodation to move to. Now, there are schemes such as the Hate Incident Practical Action Scheme, which we've detailed in the report, and supporting tenancies for people from ethnic minority backgrounds. They can offer some support to victims in their homes. But a lot of people weren't aware of the existence of those schemes, and disappointingly, a number of police officers I spoke to were also unaware of the services to which victims could be referred. Now, it is in the service procedure, so it suggested perhaps the training needed to be a little more in-depth and needed to accompany the service procedure and be very much focused on that service procedure. So the committee suggested that the PSNI should reconsider its training and should look particularly at early intervention and how it may work better with and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. The committee also looked at offenders, which is a difficult area to review from a human rights perspective. There is no profile as such for an offender. It can be anyone, and that's part of the problem. Hate crimes, they're certainly perpetrated by political extremists and members of organised hate groups, but mostly they're committed by ordinary people around us, sort of people who may even turn up to a conference like this. The perpetrator may be a stranger to the victim, maybe, however, a neighbour, a colleague, even a service provider. And if we assume that offenders somehow identify themselves by allegiance to particular groups, the nature and scale of hate crime is going to be missed. Now, it's easier to identify problem areas, profiles of areas in which hate crime is high and the triggers to hate crime. And I was very impressed at how much the PSNI was working to build its profiles of hate crime and of offenders, but would suggest that a more consistent approach is perhaps needed across Northern Ireland. But certainly by its enhanced community engagement, the police have been trying to address the significant underreporting of hate crime, and this feeds into everything that we identified in the report. We know it's underreported, with numerous victims never coming forward at all. And until those victims are comfortable about reporting to the police and believe they'll be protected, then nothing really is going to change. The police can't do very much if they don't know about it. Confidence in reporting, we know, is improved at least partly, but by no means totally, by successful prosecution. Demonstrating the police and the prosecutors not only take hate crime seriously, but can actually bring offenders to justice. And to date, there's no point pretending otherwise, the statistics are discouraging. But the police and PBS have been working together, working with renewed focus, let me put it that way, to ensure better, more successful outcomes for victims. The committee is hopeful this renewed focus will begin to show an increase in reporting and conviction rates. And certainly it's important, I think, that if that is the case, that we start reporting upon that to encourage people to report incidents. What the committee also found is that when looking at individual cases, what works or doesn't work in a prosecution, it was very difficult because the statistics required to track those cases through the criminal justice process, so from the report to final outcome, including the conviction or acquittal, that information isn't held, unlike in England and Wales, where they have now found a method of tracking cases, albeit with a few caveats. So the committee understands the PSNI doesn't hold all that information, but the PSNI can, with the PPS and the court service, work together, it seems to the committee, to produce the information and wishes to encourage greater joint working to enable that proper assessment to be undertaken. There needs to be that commitment across the criminal justice system, because we don't know what's really going on or why the prosecution rates aren't higher, then we won't really know where to direct resources. And if all this effort and time is going into improving reporting and recording of hate crime, then we won't know unless we see it reflected in the conviction rates. The committee realised during this review that there was a range of measures, most, if not, many, if not most, of those are actually outside the remit or control of the police. But they are required to counter the hate, intolerance and offending behaviour that results from it. They include legislation, however, by no means is that the central aspect. Awareness raising, I think perhaps was one of the most important aspects of this, including acknowledging and recognising, without question, the existence and impact of hate crime on victims and also on social cohesion. They recognised the importance of confronting racism and intolerance in public discourse, the successful social inclusion of minority groups, increase in public trust in the police, which the police and the board are working very hard to improve upon. The recording and investigation of hate crime, improvements in case file preparation, for example, much of that work is already underway. Effective operational training for the police, and I think there was some just criticism of perhaps the operational race hate training. But also in terms of the engagement, that it permits, that it's really meaningful and it permits full and frank dialogue, not just between communities, but within communities, and that's facilitated and actually listened to. So the recommendations, it's hoped, will go some way to meeting that, and we'll certainly see. The police have been very accepting, I think, of the recommendations, and certainly during the course of this review, extremely open to my assessment, and have given me access to everything and every person I needed to speak with. But the most important, I think, lesson throughout all of this is that racism and hate crime that results from it will never be eradicated, will never even be reduced unless, and I'm going to take the words of Kofi Annan because I can't think of anything better, confront ignorance with knowledge, bigotry with tolerance, and isolation with the outstretched hand of generosity. And I have to say, I was surprised and pleased to see that that was very much reflected in this enhanced community engagement that the police are now pursuing. So, pardon me. I'm going to leave it there. I think I've taken up more than enough time. But I want to leave you with some sense of optimism. As work progresses, I do think it's in good hands. We have Superintendent Emma Bond, who's going to be sitting on the panel. She's the silver lead, and ACC Barbara Gray, who's the gold lead. And both I've had the opportunity to watch. Sounds a bit creepy, but I've seen them work in various different aspects of policing, and they're formidable and committed to taking this forward successfully, and I think almost certainly will take this in the right direction. We also have a Chief Constable who is one of the probably loudest advocates of human rights. I was going to say biggest, but that sounds very rude. One of the loudest advocates, champions, if you like, of human rights protection for all. And last but not least, ACC Mark Hamilton, if he's still here. We're very lucky that he is the national lead on hate crime. And when I spoke to him at quite an early stage, I was impressed and delighted, I'm not going to say surprised, delighted at the extent of his knowledge and understanding and the unique perspective that he was able to bring from across the UK to Northern Ireland. I do sometimes think we maybe underuse him in this respect because of competing priorities, but certainly he can give us that unique perspective, and his input will be crucial. So I think while there is some criticism in the report, there's a lot of support for the police, and there's a lot of recognition of the very good work they're doing. And I suspect that if we come back in a year or 2 years, somebody will be telling you that the police deserve real credit for taking this in hand and really starting to deliver the sort of service that we should be proud of. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ali. It should have said, actually, there are copies of Ali's report at the back of the room. Please feel free to take a copy of the full report. She did provide a very succinct overview. But just before I pass over to Paul, just on behalf of the Chair and the Vice Chair of the Board and the members of the Board, just to formally acknowledge at this event the work that Ali has done on the Race Hate Thematic Review on behalf of the Board, a very comprehensive review, as always, in the work that she does, and I just wanted to give that tribute to her before we passed over to Paul. Paul, over to you. I should have said, actually, I did say to Paul, how long will you take? And he said 6 hours. I've given him 16 minutes, and he's told me he could do it.
You give me 20. I'm not haggling now. Okay. So, if we can press the button, it's on. I'll put it back in again. The last time I spoke without a projector was my wedding reception, and that didn't go well. So. Okay, we're on. Okay, so my name's Paul Janassi. I lead the Cross-Government Hate Crime Programme. To put it into context, most policy in terms of policing, in terms of protecting communities, comes out of getting things wrong. It either comes out of a tragedy that's happened that we hadn't seen the signs for, or that we responded to badly. And hate crime is no exception to that. It's probably one of the most notable examples of that. And most of what we have as policy today stems from the Stephen Lawrence murder in 1993 and a racist attack. And more importantly, the failure of the authorities, the failure of the state to recognise it for what it was and to offer the service to the family which they deserved and had a right to expect. And what it's brought around is probably the most significant change in my 30 years of policing career, not just about the way we deal with hate crime, but the way we have a relationship with minority communities, to the way we investigate murders and the way we deal with intelligence. So it's massively changed the structure and massively has an impact on the response to hate crime in particular. And in 2005 there was a review done about where we were with the recommendations from the 1999 report of the Independent Inquiry, and it found that there was a need to coordinate policy, that lots of state actors were doing the right sort of things, were acting out in a positive way, but that they were going off in tangents. There wasn't a cohesion to the policy. And my role is really, I was a seconded police officer, seconded in to run a programme which brings victims to the heart of decision making. So the victims and the advisory groups don't dictate policy, they don't tell a minister what decision they have to make, but no decision would be made by a minister or by a criminal justice executive without them understanding what the victims and the experts want them to understand when they make that decision. So that's really my role, and that role in terms of policing is I work with Mark Hamilton, who was, you've just heard, has got the national policing lead. So we represent policing nationally in this, and we have a single policing policy. The only other involvement I've got with Northern Ireland is in terms of foreign policy. So obviously that's not devolved, so I represent Northern Ireland in the communications and the negotiations on international stage when it relates to hate crime. So I'm going to first off talk about some of the principles, and Alison's already covered some of these, and apologies if that's not overly clear. So a hate crime we take to be any crime where the victim is chosen because of who they are or how they live their life. It's not that they left the car window open, it's because the perpetrator had a hostility to something about them in their life. And you can see how that applies to racism clearly, but that would also apply to gang violence, it would also apply to football violence. So what we needed to do, one of the first things when we came together in 2007 as a programme, is decide what we mean by hate crime, because there wasn't a consistency of understanding. So there were some key principles that we understood when we reached our understanding of what we mean by hate crime. And what we did is we took in account, particularly the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. But one of the fundamental things is actually hate crime is a term that there isn't even a consensus about where hate crime comes from. Lots of people trace it back to the civil rights movement in the 1960s in America, dealing with the civil rights of black communities. But actually some women's rights groups say it actually goes back longer than that. It was about misogynistic violence. But it's quite misleading, because to many victims, hatred is a word that is quite strong. And we don't have to prove hatred. The only legislation that mentions hatred, certainly in England and Wales, is the incident hatred offence, and even then we don't have to prove that the offender hated, we just have to prove that they were doing things which were likely to stir up hatred. So what we mean is hostility, and what we have to prove to get an enhanced sentence is that the offender either demonstrated or was motivated by a hostility, wholly or partially by a hostility, race, religion, sexual orientation, disability and transgender. So that was kind of one of the fundamental principles. Alison mentioned earlier, and it's really important, that our policy, I believe, follows a human rights approach, and it's really important. She said, very importantly, equality isn't about doing the same thing for different people. Equality is about outcome. If it's safe for me to walk from my home to the petrol station to fetch milk, as I'm regularly ordered to do at 10 o'clock at night, it should be safe for somebody who's got Down syndrome. It should be safe for somebody who's here because they're fleeing genocide in a troubled part of the world. It should be safe for somebody who is transgender to have that same thing. So hate crime is a way of dealing with when that goes wrong, and it's a way of understanding it. So within that, we have certain principles from the Stephen Lawrence inquiry which are really important. The first one was about perception-based recording. So we record based on the perception of the victim or any other person. So what it found is that the police were what they referred to as secondary victimizing victims, because if you suffer a hate crime and then the police deny that it was a hate crime, it's likely to add to the burden and add to the harm that it causes. So we record based on the perception of the victim or any other person. But we also record non-crime hate incidents, which is counterintuitive for many people, particularly from policing, in terms of dealing with things and responding things that aren't crimes. But we obviously, within the boundaries of proportionality, have a responsibility to stop them escalating. What our advisors will say is nobody commits a murder as the first offence. They will commit escalating abuse, starting with talking ill of people, and will escalate. And if we can deal with the lower level through, not necessarily through enforcement, but through education and engagement, then we can stop some of the tragedies happening, even though we might not be able to quantify that. So secondly, the final point I want to make about the policy is there are people who see hate crime as broader than this. There is an ongoing debate at the moment about whether misogyny should be included, whether gender-based, whether there is other types of hate crime. And the murder of Sophie Lancaster is a tragic example of how hatred can manifest itself in ways that we don't necessarily quantify as hate crime. So very intentionally, the definition that we have shared across all criminal justice agents and all government departments is of monitored hate crime. So we're not denying the existence of others. What we're saying is these are the ones we monitor, and you obviously include sectarian hate crime here. So I'm going to start off by showing you how good we are compared to the rest of the world, and unfortunately this is the high point, so don't get too confident over this. So one of the ways we measure hate crime is about whether people have the confidence to report, whether the police and other agencies are accessible to victims who want to come forward, whether we do things to encourage reporting. And we know, as Alison said, that the vast majority of crimes never come to the attention of the police, but the harm is still being done. So being able to reach out to people who haven't got the confidence to come and demand the services is a really important part of our response. So if we measure this is figures from the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. You can see the remit of their extent. And they measure, amongst other things, human rights in that given area. And one of the things it does is measures hate crime as a measurement of the state's protection of human rights. So you'll see that we record in England and Wales, and I'll tell you on the next slide why we've used England and Wales, but we recorded 62,518 crimes last year. And when you look at those and you look by comparison, Italy, with very similar demographics, very similar population size, record less than 1 in 100 of the ones that we record. Ireland, that uses the same Stephen Lawrence definition, recorded 53 the last time it submitted data in 2014. So I would argue that actually this is a sign, not that we're more racist, not that we're more hostile, but a sign of greater confidence to report and willingness of state agents to take those complaints. And I see this as a real positive. We measure, as you'll see here, we measure, sorry, as you'll see if I didn't press the button twice. Sorry, fat fingers, as they say. Okay, what you'll see here is two sets of figures. So the figures in blue are from the crime survey. So we have a crime survey which goes to 45,000 households in England and Wales and asks people about their experience of crime. And it asks them about, if they were a victim of crime, whether that was a hate crime. So it uses the same criteria as we'd use. And what it shows is that instead of the 62,000 that we recorded, there's actually 222,000 or thereabouts that actually took place. So it shows that less than 1 in 3 has been reported to us. And actually that itself is an underestimate because it only includes people over 16, it only includes people in a residential unit, so people who are rough sleepers, people who live in residencies wouldn't be included. So even that is itself an underestimate. So we know that the vast majority of hate crime doesn't come to our attention. But you'll see the disparity there when we look at the different strands. More race hate crime is reported to us compared to other types of hate crime. When you look at disability, less than 1 in 25, one in I should have done the maths before I started speaking, but a lot less are recorded in terms of the numbers that come to attention. So you can see that the disparity is there even within hate crime. When we look at race hate crime, we know that a black family born, educated and living in Belfast, working in a hospital, would have confidence to know that if they're a victim of race hate crime, they have confidence that they could expect to be treated as such. But a newly arrived asylum seeker fleeing genocide in a different part of the world, where the police were part of the problem that they're fleeing from, will not have that same confidence. So we have to do more for certain types of victims. And then finally, you'll see that the survey also tells us that 48% of those 222,000 came to the attention of the police. So what that tells us is we've got two problems. We've got one, that 52% of people didn't tell us about the crimes at all, But when they did, there was a big proportion of crimes that are recorded in there as assaults or criminal damage, but the hostility element has not been recorded and not been picked up. And this is where it really starts to become depressing, because what the survey also does is talks about victims' experiences once they've come to report. So this is England and Wales data, I should hasten to add. So the first thing it measures is about repeat victimisation. So one of the measures of success is if people come and tell us about something, how do we help them to not be a victim in the future? Through target hardening, through advice, through protection measures. And unfortunately with hate crime, there is a greater multiple victimisation. So there's a great repeat victimisation. And you'll see there that in terms of household crime, 35% of hate crime victims are repeats compared to 25% of victims in general. And this is the really kind of depressing. As somebody who's involved in national police policy, victims are not satisfied when they come to us. Victim satisfaction levels are lower than crime in general. Now, that's really disappointing because there isn't a chief constable in the country who wouldn't say that hate crime is important. So when we see that satisfaction levels were 52% compared to 73% for crime victims in general. When you look at fairness, 59% said they were treated fairly compared to 81% of crime victims in general. So that tells us clearly what we're trying to do isn't working. And for me, that's one of three things, or a combination of three things. One is the police officers and the police professionals are not delivering with the importance that the chief officers hold for their subject. Secondly, that victims' expectations are unrealistic in what they expect. And thirdly, and I think really kind of importantly, is there are certain things that as police we're not overly good at. We're not good at getting to things as quickly as we'd want to. We're not good at keeping people updated when it goes into the criminal justice system. We're not good a month down the line of going back and spending time with people talking about the impact it had on them. And if you come from a community that's distrustful of the police, my sense is that you're probably going to see those things as discriminatory rather than incompetent, and that's a really difficult challenge for us, and one that as police organisations we have to work on. And then for me this is the compelling evidence, if you can see it, and I'll tell you what it says, but this is the compelling evidence of why hate crime has to be considered as a priority area. You'll see that 92% of hate crime victims were emotionally affected by the crime, compared to 81% of victims in general. But when you look at the bits you probably can't see, which is anxiety and panic attacks and depression, victims of hate crime are 4 times more likely to suffer those more serious psychological harm. And if that isn't compelling evidence as to why hate crime is a priority, and the picture for me, which is actually a Northern Ireland crime historically, is really tells you everything you need to know. If you come home and face that, then where do you go for your place of safety? Because if we feel unsafe when we're in a town, we think we go home, we shut the door, and suddenly we're in a place of safety. And if that happens to you at your home, you obviously aren't given that luxury. What I'm going to briefly do is just talk through the summer of 2016, because we were undoubtedly tested in a way that we've never been tested before on a series of incidents last year. And I accept that this wasn't maybe played out as much here as it was in parts of England in particular and Wales. But we had some significant challenges, and we've done a lot of work to try and understand what happened and what the impact was. And I have to say it's probably the first time where mainstream politics has started to challenge, or people within mainstream politics have started to challenge the approach to hate crime. And we've seen universal support. I've worked under the 3 main parties in Westminster, and each has been equally committed to driving this agenda forward. But we started to see people from within established political parties challenging us to see whether we're actually exacerbating a problem that existed. So what we saw during the summer of 2016, we saw a huge increase in recorded hate crime, and that's all we can be certain of from this stage. So the green figures are 2015, the same period of time, and you'll see it starts from the 17th of June, which is the week before the referendum, and then follows the 11 weeks that follow that. And what you'll see that the lighter green is 2016's figures, and there's a significant peak for a period of time. We see significant spikes after terrorist incidents, but they tend to last 2 or 3 days and return to normality really quite quickly. But what we saw there a 46% increase, and it peaked actually 5 weeks later at a 58% increase on the year before. So quite a significant rise of crime. And what that manifested as is we saw a figure that ranged from 58 to 27%, depending on how many weeks, the more weeks you include, the less the percentage rise for obvious reasons. But we saw a huge and significant rise in recorded hate crime. So what we saw is some crime like this, which was linking to the divisions that appeared. Now, I wouldn't for 1 minute suggest that the political party mentioned were condoning this sort of behaviour, but actually what we saw is divisions occurring in society. We saw divisions in workplaces, in families, in towns, and it really became quite hostile in a way that I've never experienced it before. And what you saw is people committing here clearly a hate crime, clearly a racist hate crime targeting Polish people, but linking it to the debate that was going on. And it's that issue that not everybody who was supportive of one argument or the other would use hostility or demonstrate hostility, but people who came out were using the political process as part of it. And what you also saw is significantly more, but less reported, indignation about the divisions that were occurring. We saw people becoming politically motivated in a way that I've never experienced before. Young people in particular, who were so indignant at what they were seeing as the racism in their communities that they were coming out in opposition to it. So we know that all these factors played a role. So what we've tried to do is to work out what caused that rise in hate crime. So one of them is we expect peaks in summer. People are out in summer, people are drinking alcohol more in summer, there are more people on the street, and we expect to see a rise in hate crime in summer compared to winter months. We expect to see year-on-year improvements. We've recorded an 18% increase in recorded crime for the last few years, where we've seen a similar decrease in the crime survey's estimates. So we're closing that gap of underreporting. And that's through relationships with civil society. It's through things like better data systems and reaching out to communities. We saw the divisions that occurred around the referendum. But we also saw other incidents that were playing out in that same period of time. We saw the attack in Orlando on the gay community. And what we know from our experience, when Jewish people were murdered in the attack in Paris, their only role in that attack was as victims, but we saw a huge rise in anti-Semitism in the weeks that followed, and we think that was about fear of crime amongst the Jewish community, and being more likely to report things that they wouldn't have just accepted in the meantime. But it's also about an increased police presence. After the terrorist attacks in Manchester, we were going to mosques and people were walking up to us and reporting hate crimes, and clearly they wouldn't have done so had there not been a police presence in the sensitive locations. So we know that crimes that happen across the world will have an impact. We saw the tragic murder of an MP in what was clearly a racist, far-right motivated attack from somebody who was objecting to her support for asylum seekers. So we saw extreme violence, which kind of got lost in the political narrative around the time because of the referendum. We saw the attack in Ataturk Airport, which got lots of coverage on the street, and we saw this horrible situation in Nice where there was lots of coverage in the news about that. And we looked at this to say, can we plot these crimes against the rises? Can we see a correlation between these crimes happening around the world and this? So we looked, and we actually found there was 360 terrorist attacks in the month of June in the world. Now, I knew of 2 of them. I knew of the Orlando and the Joe Cox murder, Ataturk, so 3. But there was 357 others that I'd never heard of. So you see that these things are covering, and actually what you get is coverage of some because they're close to us, or because there's good footage of it, or because it's a place that we go to on holiday and it's more relevant to us as a story. And what we saw a similar spike after the Westminster attack, but it was very different. It was very different in its nature of response to, for instance, the Lee Rigby murder and the response to the murder of Lee Rigby 3 years earlier. And what we saw is a huge we saw a spike for a couple of days, but it wasn't clearly as serious. The attacks on mosques weren't happening, it was individual public order offences. And there was clearly a difference. And one of the things that it was described to me is, you've got to understand what offends the sensibilities of the people who are likely to act out violent because of their anger at something. We were all angry about Westminster. We saw, I was inside, There was lots of school children in there was lots of old people in there. We saw the murder of a police officer, an unarmed police officer defending those of us who were inside. And it was clearly something that caused us immense affront. But we don't commit hate crime because we're affronted. So the people who do probably wouldn't have that same affinity to a police officer who died doing their duty. They probably wouldn't have the same affinity to MPs. They would see them as hostile to MPs. So you've got to understand enough about the crimes and what you're dealing with on the world stage to understand when the triggers are likely to be more significant. So we saw a greater response to Manchester because of the nature of the victims and the nature of the crime than we did with Westminster. So, finally, just a couple of solutions, if I may, and just one example of how things can go well when we work together. The relationship with civil society, and I'm sure Patrick will nod approvingly when we talk about this, is absolutely key to solving this. And I have to say that some of our responses through the last 20, 30 years have been superficial. That we've had superficial relationships which we do to make ourselves feel better more often than integrating it into our core services. And if we put the effort in to do so, we can make real advantage from it. And we've got to have relationships which are meaningful, trustworthy, and developed. And one of the quotes here from John Grieve, who sits on our advisory group and has had quite a role here. John Grieve says, you can't make your friends when the bullets are flying. You've got to put the work in to build the relationships, to deploy them when things go wrong. You have to do it in advance. And this is an example of that. So this is Tal Mama, which is a group that supports anti-Muslim hate crime that we are working with. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of the challenges and what we do. So real friends accept criticism. So we wouldn't want Tal Mama, we wouldn't feel ideally ideal to Tal Mama if they did everything every time they wanted to criticise as they did it in public. We would like them to do it in private. We would like to put things right rather than to be criticised by them. And having that constructive relationship, which ultimately allows them the chance to go public if they don't resolve it, is really important. So we've got to accept criticism. We have to share ideals, and this is really important because there are some people in some groups, some victims groups, who purport to be supporting victims of hate crime who would actually condone other types of hate crime. And we have a principle and a condition of working with people is that they will condemn all hate crime. And we have a saying that was attributed to a former Attorney General, which says if you can condemn all hate crime, you're part of the solution. If you can only condemn some, you're part of the problem. And you can't be involved in human rights and see it as selective. They're not human rights if they're selective. So having those shared ideals and areas of trust is really important. So what that enables us to do is to reach data sharing agreements. So we have formal data sharing agreements with 3 national organisations where we can see each other's information. And here's an example of how that works. So what we see here is Greater Manchester's anti-Muslim hate crime from 2015. And you'll see there that what it says is there was 402 anti-Muslim hate crimes in that year. And you'll see that a proportion of them came first to Tal Mama and were shared with the police, but the majority came direct to the police and were shared with Tal Mama. But being able to see that big picture is really important, and being able to have their figures involved in ours so we get that big picture in the crime is really important. So what we have resources through True Vision. So True Vision is a web resource that's owned by the National Police Chiefs Council. It's there as a resource. It had in the week of the referendum, it had 10,000 visits in a week. It normally averages about 4,000, but that's more than we get hate crimes. So people can get there, they can report online. All of our policies are on there. It's a valuable resource to us. But what makes that work is the fact that we use social media to reach out to affected communities. It is phenomenally valuable, and I'll finish with an example, if I may. So one of the example I'm finishing with is from Golders Green. In 2015, a neo-Nazi group decided they wanted to have a march through Golders Green. Golders Green, for those who don't know, is North London, and it's an area which is densely populated by Orthodox Jewish communities. And what we had here is a group that wanted to march through there, have a neo-Nazi march on the Sabbath through a Jewish area. It would cause immense affront, immense fear. Lots of the marches that have happened like this have led to violence. The community were nervous, the community were affronted. And during that process, while the Met were doing all of the community outreach and their intelligence to decide what they could do in terms of controlling the march, this was posted on one of the organisers' websites. And honestly, it's as if he's got the points to prove out of the manual and said, right, I want to get them all on one page. And he's literally tried to prove the offence of inciting racial hatred, but he hit every box. So this is deeply vile. It's clearly depicting Jews as weeds. It's suggesting they should be killed. It's motivating people to donate money. It's linking it to the actions of Hitler and the Nazis. It's clearly a massively affronting document and was the core of a conviction for Joshua Bonehill Payne, who was the individual who posted it. He posted that material on his website to try and motivate people to come to that protest. The CST, our partners, reported it at 10 o'clock in the morning to the police. 11 o'clock, a police officer was taking a statement, and at 2 o'clock, Joshua Bonehill Payne was arrested. He was kept in custody. The CPS authorised a charge for inciting racial hatred, having consulted with the Attorney General, and he was remanded in custody. So a really swift and thorough response from the criminal justice side. But what we also were able to do, and this is where that social media thing comes out, this is a summary of an advert that we used to reach out to the Jewish community. So what it tells us is that we reached out with this story of reassurance to the Jewish community in the UK, and reached 76,000, which, to put it into context, is around about 1 in 4 of the Jewish population received that, and nearly 1,000 interacted with it by sharing or commenting on it. And the cost of that, as you'll see there, was really minimal, but we were able to reach out with messages in a targeted way. And what the outcome of it for me, and this is the heartwarming bit, this is the bit to finish with, is when we all come together, we can have really effective responses to this. Because Joshua Bonehill Payne is still in prison, having been sentenced to 3.5 years for the inciting hatred. The police got the evidence to allow them to put restrictions on the march, and they held it in Westminster on the day they wanted. But 19 neo-Nazis turned up in Westminster, standing between the line of police officers and the public who saw it. The Jewish community were not present in that area. And what we did have is we had a march turning out in Golders Green on that day, and it was a march of everybody bar the Jewish community standing out in solidarity and saying, we stand together. And for me, this is the way to combat this extreme hatred. It's about everybody playing a role, about the criminal justice system, along with civil society, and then along with the community, coming up and standing to say that none of us will tolerate this, and we're working together for solutions. So thanks very much.
I would just like to thank Paul for the very insightful presentation, and also for being succinct. I would like to ask Ali and the board chair and Superintendent Emma Bond just to join the panel at this stage. I should have said at the beginning, Emma is the PSNI Silver Lead for hate crime, and is sitting on the panel today, although there are obviously the Chief Constable's in the audience, and I'm probably happy to field any questions. He's probably still missing the board. We have until about 1:45, 10 to 2. Paul has a flight, and I am very conscious that it's lunchtime, so I am going to just go straight out to questions. We do have roving mics because we are live streaming, so I would ask you to use the mic, just introduce yourself and also just your question and who you would like to answer it. So I'm just going to open the floor at this stage if there's any questions. Okay, we have a couple of questions in the middle here. Thank you.
My name is Robin McVeigh. I'm a researcher. I suppose, and this is going to be immediately a negative intervention, but there's a reason why I think this isn't going to work, and I suppose there's 2 key points from my point of view. The first is recorded on page 46 of the report, where it says there's no such thing as hate crime in Northern Ireland, and that's legally that's true. But if you can imagine you're an ordinary police officer out there who carries some of the prejudices that Alison talked about at the start about why you really don't want to engage with hate crime. That's an excuse not to do it. So that's the first point. Until we get the legislative framework correct, it's not going to work. And I suppose the second point is that we've had both the PSNI and the Policing Board engaging with the idea that there's something that can be characterised as ethnic cleansing being carried on by paramilitary organisations in Northern Ireland. That's completely different order of hate crime from anything that you have to deal with in England, Wales, or Scotland. So there's a paramilitary-sized elephant in the room which hasn't really been addressed at all. And I think until we do find a way of speaking to that, then we're not going to sort the problem out here.
Okay, would anybody like to respond? Paul?
Okay, there was a couple of things, I try not to comment on the last part other than generally, but you talked about the legislative framework. For me, the most important part of the response is the police and criminal justice definition, because actually any law could be broken. It could be a murder, it could be a public order offence. So the reality is, if you put that framework around in terms of policy, I think you can make a significant difference with a kind of disparate legislation that we have. I think the point you came to in terms of attitudes and culture is really important. So that I think I joined a police force that was really, I joined on day one in the middle of the miners' strike and was told, you walk on the outside of the street, you don't move for anybody, everybody moves for you, and you're command of this thing. I left a police service which has got a very different attitude about serving the community. And that cultural change that we saw in response to Stephen Lawrence requires all sorts of things. It requires leadership, it requires scrutiny, it requires robust rules and regulations about behavioural standards. And John Grieve, who for me is one of the most influential people in policing in my career, talked about finding the practical cop elements and thinking and going, not only setting the standard and saying we will actively control if you step over the line, but we will actually go out and spend time with cops explaining why it's the right thing to do and why it's important. And that doesn't happen overnight. You can't change a culture overnight. Just on that last final point, without commenting on the issues here, I've seen this being put in place in South Africa. I've seen it being put in place in Kosovo. I've seen it being put in place in Bosnia. And kind of the challenges in every kind of area are different. But for me, the kind of key message, and Alison picked up on it, is if you see this as a human rights approach and don't see it as serving community A or serving community B, you stand a better chance of getting universal support for it. And if everybody identifies it as about protecting them, you stand more chance to get universal backing.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, you were looking to come in just...
Thanks very much, Daniel Holder, CAJ. Look, the board's human rights reports and seminars like this are always very useful as a first comment. I have a very specific and rather heavy question, which, as you may expect, specifically just to drill down on the issue of the duties of the police around intervening or taking executive action. That's the phrase used to remove materials that would constitute racist expression or homophobic or sectarian and the other stuff, but I know today we're dealing specifically with race, so I know examples, sort of racist slogans that are publicly displayed, or say the flag of a paramilitary organisation that's engaged in racist violence and intimidation that's then put outside the house of a migrant or someone who moves into an area, etc. I know quite often the answer given is that the police duty is only to intervene where there's a threat to life or public safety, there's no other clear legal duty, and I don't think that's right. I think if the material in question constitutes stirring up hatred on a protected ground under the 87 order as it is here, then you're in a situation where there's both powers and at times duties to intervene, to remove that material, to prevent crime just under the general duties. It's quite similar to the issue that relatively recently was before the Supreme Court in the DB case that related to another matter related to whether the police had powers to intervene in relation to unauthorised public processions, where they held quite clearly, yes, under the duties to prevent crime, when that is an offence, there is a duty to intervene in particular circumstances. So I just wanted to tease that out in terms of the understanding that in terms of the types of materials that would be captured as stirring up hatred, is it seen that there is a duty to take executive action to intervene in those circumstances, that it's not actually limited to circumstances where there's a threat to life?
Well, I suppose what I would say is that there isn't necessarily a single answer to that or a carte blanche approach. I think that actually every single incident or situation that we would propose would have to be looked at as an individual case on a case-by-case basis in terms of actually what action is the most appropriate. Obviously there will and have been situations across Northern Ireland where there perhaps has been racist graffiti, homophobic graffiti, or issues that actually then are causing their continued presence causes not only anxiety or fear to the individual victim but then to other persons in the community. And there are examples where we have worked with other partners, be it local councils or others, to take steps to have that removed. The issues around flags and other matters have obviously been subject to much discussion over the past number of weeks, very much at a political level. It is probably not necessarily as straightforward as it is for some of the other areas relating to hate, and the bottom line is that for a lot of these issues, that the approach, the direct enforcement effort and the role of police is not the single solution to this. And actually what police won't do is necessarily take any action that will mean that there will be a more detrimental impact in terms of communities, victims, individuals or others. So where it is appropriate, we will absolutely fulfil our obligations in terms of looking after communities and in particular looking after victims. But I don't think that there is a generalised answer or specific response, because that would all be done on an individual basis, depending on the context, the engagements and the views of everybody concerned.
Okay, I'm going to ask Ali just to come in as well.
Yeah, I think Daniel makes a really important point, and one of the reasons why this report is quite long is that I thought it might be helpful to set out the variety of laws that actually were available, because I think we skirt around it too often and say the law's not in place or we need more law. We're not using the law we have, so adding more law on top of it is just more law that we're not going to use. Clearly there is a responsibility to act in certain cases, and I think Emma has given a very honest answer, which is a decision may be taken for and maybe a tactical decision, or the police exercising discretion, and if that's exercised properly, I don't think anyone could criticise. However, to start off from the basis that there isn't power to do it, or it should be confined to an Article 2 sort of situation, I think is a mistake, but not a mistake I've seen repeated as much recently as previously, if I can put it that way. But I think Daniel's absolutely right. We can't skirt around the issue. There are laws in place. The police have duty to enforce the law, and when there is a breach, then they need to deal with it.
Paul, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just one really minor point, because just in relation to the internet presents extra challenges. And that material which I showed you, which brought around the person who posted it going 3.5 years in prison, is still available. He's in prison, but the material's there. And if it had been on Facebook, we've done a lot of work with organisations like that to get terms of reference which would have it taken down. But because he owns the space, we can't take it down. We will try through licence conditions to stop him posting similar material. But it's actually there, and we've got a kind of hole in our legislation in that we've got no power to take it down. If it was terrorism, it would be different. But
and from a board perspective, this is an issue that comes up each year in the board, and throughout the presentations today and even in the film, there was a recognition that this was a wider societal response and not just a policing one. Do you want to talk just about how that might manifest itself and what that response would look like in terms of the wider society?
Well, I mean, it obviously it is, and what I think I took heart from was when Ali was speaking about the fact that the police have accepted all of the recommendations. They want to make the changes. They've already looked at their governance structures. They have already looked at training, which is a big issue in terms of what was raised from the floor about attitude and understanding of what's happening. And the board is certainly can monitor all of this through its plan, because it's very clearly in our plan that it's a strategic objective that people need to be protected, particularly the vulnerable. We have put in very robust measures for this year to monitor the race hate crime in particular, but all crime, and we implement that, but it's very much in a partnership mode. And I think we hope that the programme for government will go ahead, because that is looking at outcome-based work based on partnership, and we need to ensure that all the partners are involved. But I think we do need to look at the legislation, and as Ali said, it's there. We need to raise awareness, because we see people do stand by and let these things happen, and we need to look at education. So it's a real need to bring all of the partners in and not just to look at the police response.
Okay, thank you. We have a question at the back here. Gentleman at the back.
Cormac Campbell from The Detail. Further to what Daniel had asked, is there an implication there that there's incidents where items such as that have been put, say, outside a house, it's been recorded as a crime, and even though it's recorded as a crime, they still don't remove it? The graffiti or the flag or the slogan? Are there incidents where the issue is recorded as a crime, and even despite that, the item in question still isn't removed?
I can't sit and give you a categorical yes, that is the case, or no, it isn't. What I can tell you
You
is,
could say if it was the actual policy, if it's a crime, remove this.
well, the actual removal of items, depending on who owns the property, we would always work with partners, be it through the housing executive, be it through local councils or others, to actually attempt to get anything that is posted, be it on walls or that is causing offence, to have it removed.
But if you've recorded it as a crime, I was the reason to question about that.
Well, it's around the ability and where we would go in order to actually work with partners to have it removed. So, but as it is a crime, we will work, be it through the local engagements that we have through PCSPs and through others, to ensure that it does come down. Sometimes that will be contact local landlords or persons who actually own the properties, but we will work strenuously to ensure that it is removed.
Does that approach give confidence to people to actually report these things?
Well, I would hope that actually that it would. I mean, at the end of the day, as we've said, that policing isn't the only solution in order to actually try and address the issues that exist in terms of people being able to live safely within communities across Northern Ireland. The bottom line is that actually that it is the part of a broader community response, and quite often we have seen instances where there have been messages or slogans posted on walls where actually it's been the local community themselves who have come out and actively taken steps to remove it. The bottom line is that we acknowledge, and the report from the board shows that actually there is still work that we can do, and as has been said, we are committed. We accept the recommendations that are there, and where there are areas where, be it through victims, be it through community representatives or other organisations, that we're not seen to be meeting the needs of individuals within this community, then we will work hard to address those in whatever way that we can, in partnership with other agencies and other organisations that can help us to do so.
Ali, can I just ask you to comment specifically in terms of Cormac's point around confidence in reporting crime? It was the final point that I made. You met as part of the thematic review with a number of the groups and individuals who were affected by race hate crime. What are the types of things that you were hearing would give confidence to people to report?
Well, I think your point is actually very well made. If items like that are left for hours or days, then the person who walks past it, who thinks they're the target of it, is not going to have any degree of confidence if it stays there and the police are walking past it. Now, that's not happening on a very regular occasion, but I think we have to accept that it has happened, and where clearly a crime was presented and for other reasons it wasn't an intervention by the police, that does not help. There's no doubt about that. Now, I'm not the person to judge on the police's ability to respond tactically, all the considerations that may come into play in terms of how you remove it, when you remove it, etc. But that certainly doesn't help. The other thing is, I think probably one of the first things every single person said to me was the unavailability of housing, alternative housing, that they feel squeezed into areas where they're not wanted, that if they then get attacked within those areas, there's nowhere else to go. They feel the Housing Executive Housing Association aren't doing enough to accommodate them elsewhere, and if they're being told, move out of the area, but we can't tell you where to move to, well, of course you're not going to have confidence a second time, but you're going to take your own steps to try and protect your family. And what that tends to mean is that people scatter into really not nice private accommodation, private rental accommodation or HMOs or whatever, and that the trouble follows them. I think some of the campaigns the police have run and the videos that are on their websites are really helpful, because it says we actually do want to engage with you and look at this, and this is what we can do to help. I'm not sure they're getting mass coverage. I think they could be put out there more. I think more people need to see it. But even down, I was in court last week on a completely unrelated case, and the hate crime poster was right outside the door of the court, which I thought was good to see. I think events like this, again, if it got maybe wider coverage, I don't know how many people will actually watch, are important to show all these different people coming together saying that hate crime is abhorrent and we're not going to stand for it. So simple messages, in a way, are the strongest. And just finally, I think something which is in the comes out, I hope, strongly in the report, but I didn't mention, at Paul did, working with civil society, we have groups who have the relationships, have the trust of these victims, who are picked up at times. They're not funded. They're certainly not funded with any continuity, and they're used when a crisis arises, but they're not invested in. And then we wonder why the engagement isn't working. So those groups that we already have links with these people who can encourage them to report and can instill confidence, are not being valued, I think, and are being allowed to fall by the wayside. So that's a very serious mistake I think we're making.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, you're looking to come in, is it at this point or is it? Okay.
Having set the ball rolling on that one, I wanted to try and make a constructive suggestion, which is PSNI has a hate crimes policy or service procedure that's very meaty, that's very lengthy, that's very detailed in a lot of things. But at present it doesn't cover this specific issue of when executive action will be taken to remove material that stirs up hatred, and perhaps that's something that could be dealt with. And as you said, there are case-by-case considerations, there are different factors in relation to how and when to exercise those powers, but if that could be set out in a service procedure in relation to its broad parameters, I think that would be very helpful in narrowing and clarifying and providing a bit of legal certainty over the circumstances in which intervention will take place.
Thank you. Emma, do you want to comment on that, or?
Just other than to say I'm happy to take the feedback that has come up today and to factor it into our considerations in terms of our service instruction.
Okay, thank you. Paul, is there anything from a UK perspective on that you could comment on?
Well, just in terms of our policy, which is obviously a shared policy, what we don't try and do is draw a line in the sand, because you get similar things with sort of anti-Israel protests where there is anti-Semitic material or deemed to be anti-Semitic material or pro-Hamas material. And that tactical decision not to go into a crowd and start arresting in the middle of the crowd might be a really reasonable tactical option for the operations commander, but it does cause some disquiet from the Jewish community. So there's kind of parallels. What the guidance we've put together follows the human rights approach of balancing one person's right to express freedom of expression against another person. And we've tried to give them some of the cases that have gone through the court as an indicator, but really give the model of how you come to your decision. So what do you consider and what elements, rather than trying to say here's a line in the sand, because once you draw a line in the sand, it will be wrong in a different, similar but different context. And I think trying to give officers the framework about decision making is probably more important than actually saying here's the line in the sand.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here in the second row, and we have another one in the back row. And
my name is Patrick Yu. I'm representing the Long Island Council for Racial Equality. I think we talked a lot about the law legislation, and I think the detail also highlight the kind of gap in between the law and enforcement. My understanding, 2 years ago, the Law Commission in England and Wales, and they put up, a very good recommendation to review the existing hate crime law. Because the hate crime law in UK, in Northern Ireland, they say we just copy and paste in here. We coming from different period of time, and a lot of law are not necessarily coherent, nor they talk to each other. So I think for me, it is important. The legal protection is so important to the community. If you don't get the right law, the right place, I think bear in mind a lot of issue about chicken and egg between evidence. And I think we all know very well, despite maybe very hardworking, by the police, we couldn't get all the evidence. The evidence also rely on, the willingness by the victim who provide more information. If we're looking at that process, then I think we should also think about in Northern Ireland, should we, start the same process to looking at, that kind of gap and how we improve the existing law. Thank you.
thank you. I'm going to actually ask just as a final question, and then the panel can comment on both of them. The lady at the back.
Hello, my name's Claire. I'm a master's student at Ulster University, and I am currently looking into collaborative arts and music projects in terms of building interaction between dominant voices and ethnic minority communities. And I wanted to pose the question to the panel, do you think these projects play a part in improving social cohesion to avoid escalation to the point where police intervention is necessary?
Paul, you look as if you have a smile on your face.
Just on those 2 points.
Yeah.
those who weren't aware, that Patrick was talking about the Law Commission report, which for me, if anybody wants to understand the legal process around this, it's a really good starting point. It's a really comprehensive review. Government hasn't yet responded to it. There was a manifesto commitment that would, obviously things have changed a couple of times since the referendum came along, and then, I think the government hasn't announced that it's not going to respond to it. It's just taken longer for various reasons than maybe expected. But for me, it's a really comprehensive review, particularly that consideration around around the incitement legislation was really strong, and the equalising of the legislation. But it's a really good starting point if people want to understand the legal decisions around it. In relation to art, for me, the kind of social media response, and I put up that image of the kind of the people who were indignant of the hostility. Some of the creativity is fantastic, and we've actually taken a view that we stand more success to find those bits of art, alias art normally, and trying to promote them than putting up a fresh message saying we are the police and we don't like this. So if we can find those sort of random bits there was a fantastic piece of work in Manchester of a young Asian lad who stood in St Anne's Square with a blindfold on and a rucksack and said, "If you trust me, hug me," words to that effect. And thousands of people came up and hugged him. And that as a bit of street art was so much better than anything I could say in terms of promoting positive public relationship. So we've started to try and work on help as a kind of move the wave along, rather than trying to stand and start and say, look, we think this, and there's massively more we can do, and sort of taking advantage of it is a really key part, I think, for us and for communities.
Okay, thank you. Any other members of the panel want to comment on either Patrick or Claire's questions?
In respect to Patrick's, what I don't want to leave the impression that I was suggesting law wasn't necessary. I think it absolutely is needed. I was concentrating on the other things that are also essential, and I think sometimes if we just move to legislation first, we lose all the other aspects of it, and it's an easy way out just to pass a piece of legislation. In terms of the projects, as I say, just back from 5 days at Glastonbury, so I saw directly the effect of art and music on community, and it was just breathtaking. I mean, I'm still struggling to get my voice to regain my voice, to be able to speak, and part of that was an experience which was so moving, given all the events that have happened. But I saw all the stands, all the projects that are ongoing, and the impact of those is, you simply can't measure it, and I'm not sure we're very good here. And I did mention about working with civil society. I think we undervalue the role of all these other players. We concentrate too much on the police and the authorities, but we're just letting it go. We're not investing in any of that.
Okay, I'm going to give the last word to the chair.
Well, I absolutely agree about the arts and education. I think we've mentioned legislation and education is so important, but I think we've lost our way with the arts. We've lost our soul completely. We don't see it as important, an emphasis on everything. I think it's very important. It helps people to get different perspectives. It helps people to integrate. And even in Glastonbury, I noticed that there were people of my age integrating with younger people, and everybody was having a good time. But we really do need to get back to that. And the sad thing is, when we see a spike in hate crime, that money goes to areas that people think will help, and actually it's taken away from youth projects and art projects and the things that really will help people to understand and to integrate. So I'm looking forward to seeing your research. I think it will be brilliant.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the panel for the contributions, and also just to thank everyone who came along here today, particularly in terms of lunchtime. And just a reminder, in terms of our next seminar is on Wednesday the 27th September. It will be here, and it is in relation to local policing delivering for communities. And you're all very welcome. Thank you.